Hi, my name is Amy Shober, and I'm with the University of Delaware. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge my co-authors, Deanna Osman, Andrew Sharpley, Emily Duncan, and Dana Hogue. I'm excited to talk with you today about the challenges of managing phosphorus. I plan to discuss this topic in the context of trying to balance multiple goals such as soil health and water quality. My overall take-home message is that land management decisions have trade-offs. Achieving multiple goals with conservation practices will require an adaptive approach.
We know that phosphorus is a required plant nutrient that is supplied by soils, but we often need to apply additional phosphorus in fertilizers or manure to meet crop production goals. However, too much phosphorus can also be problematic as it can fuel eutrophication and the associated algal blooms in sensitive water bodies when it is lost from agricultural fields. Phosphorus transformations in the environment and multiple pathways make controlling phosphorus losses challenging. I think it's valuable to quickly review the phosphorus cycle. In general, once a large portion of the phosphorus we apply becomes fixed soil due to the presence of iron, aluminum, calcium, some portion of phosphorus will be taken up by crops, and some will be subject to loss either in erosion as part D or as phosphorus. While phosphorus leaching and subsurface transport of phosphorus is considered to be relatively minor, artificial drainage and other factors can lead to phosphorus losses in leachate or flow. There are many conservation practices that are designed to protect water quality. In fact, the USDA NRCS has more than 30 conservation practice standards that are designed to reduce soil loss, enhance nutrient use efficiency, and protect water quality. Typically, these practices are designed to achieve water quality goals can be grouped as practices that avoid, control, or trap. With regard to phosphorus, practices like nutrient management work to avoid nutrient losses by ensuring that excessive amounts of phosphorus are not applied in fertilizers or manure. Practices like tillage management and cover crops control the transport of phosphorus and soil particles. Finally, practices like vegetative buffers and grassed waterways or wetlands trap phosphorus and soil and keep them on the agricultural landscape. Among the NRCS conservation practice standards, there are 7 that are also identified as practices that improve soil health. Conservation practices can often have multiple benefits when implemented. And specifically for this discussion, we're interested in practices that connect soil quality or soil health and water quality. If you look at the list of the core soil health practices, we see that improves water quality is a benefit of all 7. I will typically refer to conservation practices in general, but for the purposes of this talk, I will focus in more detail on 3 conservation practices that are touted as benefiting both soil health and water quality, namely cover crops, conservation tillage, and nutrient management. Practices like nutrient management, cover crops, and conservation tillage are appealing to regulators, like those in the Chesapeake Bay region. Those regulators are tasked with documenting efforts to achieve load reductions to meet the Chesapeake Bay-wide Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL. In addition to the phosphorus load reduction benefits, these practices are relatively inexpensive to implement, especially when compared to urban, structural, or engineered best management practices. For example, the per pound cost of phosphorus abatement by agricultural conservation practices in the Chesapeake Bay is estimated at approximately $2,000. In contrast, the abatement cost per pound of phosphorus for urban best management practices is estimated at roughly $27,000. In addition, practices like nutrient management, cover crops, and no-till are easily verified through farm audits and transect surveys. Regulators must verify that these conservation practices are being implemented so that those acres can be input into the Chesapeake Bay Model Suite, which estimates load reductions for each bay state and sector. Conservation practices like cover crops, nutrient management, and conservation tillage are typically liked by land managers too because they do not involve taking land out of production and they are widely believed to provide soil health benefits. Perhaps the most pertinent example of regulators and farmers cashing in on the benefits of conservation practices in the Chesapeake Bay is the Maryland Cover Crop Cost Share Program. In 2018, the state of Maryland paid out approximately $18.9 million to implement cover crops on almost 396,000 acres of farmland. Compare this to the $4.75 million they spent on capital projects like manure storage units, heavy use pads, and bioswales, and the $1 million they spent on manure transport. Farmers in Maryland can get paid up to $90 per acre, depending on the cover crop planted, the planting method, and the planting window. For example, early drilled rye is considered to be the gold standard. As far as phosphorus is concerned, the potential phosphorus load reduction per acre is 0 to 15% in the Chesapeake Bay modeling suite. And regulators can count all the acres that are signed up through the state cost share program. Easy verification. As such, Maryland has become a leader among U.S. states in cover crop adoption. But this begs the question, does this type of blanket strategy really improve water quality? Or are we missing the point? Does early drilled rye result in a 15% phosphorus load reduction on every acre? Programs that promote a one-size-fits-all approach to management effectively ignore the fact that water quality and P load reductions, or even soil health benefits, are site-specific. It is likely that investing heavily into blanketing, soil health, and other conservation practices across the landscape comes at the expense of working one-on-one with the landowners. By taking a more site-specific approach to soil health and water quality, we can guide land managers to implement practices in areas of the landscape where they will be most effective toward meeting the desired goal. For example, a long-term USDA study in the Mahantango Creek experimental watershed in Pennsylvania found that phosphorus losses were not spread out evenly across the landscape. Rather, 90% of the phosphorus losses were coming from roughly 10% of the land area within the small watershed. These lands that were most vulnerable to phosphorus loss, which were called critical source areas, are areas where phosphorus sources intersect with areas of high hydrologic connectivity. Could we get more bang for the buck by identifying and focusing conservation efforts on implementing practices in critical source areas? This is not an easy question to answer. There are many concerns about equity, and in the case of the Chesapeake Bay, the method by which we quantify load reductions. In addition to recognizing the site-specific performance of conservation practices, we must also recognize that we may need to stack conservation practices in order to achieve the desired goal. Proper selection of the conservation practices for a specific site requires knowledge of the system and also willingness of the land manager to implement that practice. We often have evidence from the literature about the benefits of specific practices when implemented alone, but not when implemented as a suite of conservation practices. This can make it difficult to know how well these conservation practices will perform when they are stacked. We also need to recognize that every land management decision comes with a trade-off. Often land managers have good intentions by implementing practices like cover crops or vegetative buffers. However, in some cases, implementation of conservation practices may reduce the loads of one nutrient at the expense of another. Or they may decrease the nutrient load in one form, but increase the load from another form. Or possibly shift losses from one pathway to another. For example, cover crops are often planted to scavenge nitrogen remaining in the soil following the cash crop harvest. But in some climates, freeze-thaw events can result in the loss of dissolved P in winter runoff events when phosphorus is released from dead plant tissues. Here I show some other potential trade-offs that are documented in the literature as being associated with conservation practices. For example, Cade Menon et al. Documented that there were increases in dissolved phosphorus under no-till due to stratification and enrichment of soil P at the surface. In addition, Kleinman et al. Found that increased aggregation associated with no-till resulted in higher subsurface dissolved P losses through preferential flow pathways. Researchers have also found that phosphorus can accumulate in wetlands and buffers over time, effectively converting them from phosphorus sinks to phosphorus sources. The ability to reduce phosphorus losses from the landscape using conservation practices is also influenced by other factors like legacy P, lag time, and climate change. Let's start with legacy P. Many soils in areas with intensive animal or vegetable production have soils that are enriched with phosphorus at levels that cause environmental concern. A recent meta-analysis by Nummer et al. Revealed that conservation practices like conservation tillage, buffers, and grass waterways are highly effective at controlling particulate P losses and total P losses, but not very good at controlling dissolved P losses. Controlling dissolved P losses is a huge challenge in areas where soil test P exceeds the agronomic optimum, sometimes by more than 10 times. These legacy P soils are a significant source of dissolved P in runoff and leachate. We need new conservation practices that address dissolved P losses from landscapes. And even when we have conservation practices that help us move toward our goals, be it water quality or soil health, it can often take a long time to see improvements, sometimes on the scale of years, decades, or even centuries. With lengthy timeframes for achieving goals, we run the risk that conservation practices will not be maintained, or that they will outlive their useful lifespan and not be replaced. Finally, climate change will play a role in achieving goals with conservation practices. Changes in the frequency, duration, and intensity of storms have already impacted and will continue to affect phosphorus transport and conservation practice efficacy. In 2017 review, Jarvie et al. Highlighted the unintended, cumulative, and converging impacts of changes in land management and rainfall that resulted in dissolved phosphorus losses to Lake Erie that fueled harmful algal blooms. The authors reported a marked increase in soluble P delivered to Lake Erie starting in the early 2000s that followed an initial decline in total P load during the 80s and 90s. These increases in soluble P were to blame for the reeutrophication of Lake Erie. The authors attributed this reeutrophication to changes in land management and climate change. In brief, there was a large shift from conventional tillage to conservation tillage or no-till. This widespread adoption of no-till is credited with significant decreases in sediment and total P loads to Lake Erie in the 80s and 90s. Around the same time, the watershed also saw an increase in tile drainage because the soils of the region tended to be poorly drained. However, there was no change in the way phosphorus was managed within the region, with the bulk of the phosphorus fertilizer being broadcast and then accumulating in surface soils, which were now more hydrologically connected to the lake via the tile drains. These dissolved phosphorus losses were exacerbated by changes in weather patterns, particularly precipitation events. Planning and implementation of conservation practices at the watershed scale is expected to be more effective toward meeting P load reduction goals than implementing one-size-fits-all approaches. However, working at the watershed scale is considerably more difficult. Because of the scale, the fact that this type of planning requires more time and effort, and the need to work with a more diverse group of stakeholders. Plus, implementing conservation practices at the watershed scale may fail to result in the desired effect. For example, Osmond and others analyzed 9 federally funded conservation effects assessment projects or SEEP studies, where conservation practices were implemented at the watershed scale to reduce phosphorus and sediment. Only the 2 projects shown here demonstrated phosphorus reductions. Other projects failed to show P load reductions due to including inappropriate water quality monitoring, misunderstanding of the selection of inappropriate practices, failure of landowners to adopt or make decisions like lag times. While many of these projects are more insight into what it will take for watershed planning and implementation of conservation practices to be successful. Specifically, there is a need to identify the pollutant of concern, to ensure that the selected practices address that pollutant, and also the dominant hydrologic loss pathways. It's also important to identify the critical stakeholders and to recognize the potential trade-offs of conservation practices. It will be important to work one-on-one with farmers to ensure economic feasibility and willing to adopt. improve soil health in areas at high risk for phosphorus loss while achieving agronomic goals must be realistic, as adjusting other management practices may be necessary to achieve soil health objectives without further water quality degradation. Finally, to address water quality goals, there is a need to support development of innovative conservation practices that provide multiple ecosystem and environmental benefits, while addressing both particulate and all of this must consider economics and human behavior. Ultimately, balanced goals will require an adaptive approach, where we try different things, keep what works, and make changes when things don't work. Before I wrap up, I want to mention that there's currently a work group of scientists from across the United States who are working on an NRCS technical note titled Conservation Trade-Offs Relative to Controlling Phosphorus Loss from Agricultural Fields. This document details the potential phosphorus trade-offs related to more than 30 of NRCS conservation practices. Look for this document to be released in early 2021. With that, I thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions you may have.